Today I'm going to show you guys how to make a knife out of a basic file. You can use whatever kind you want. You can use that old rusty one you've got kicking around, or you can go get a new one. These are actually brand new. I realized I was out of these before I made the video. I got two different kinds. I have just a standard flat file and then one with a fancy handle on it. But I kind of like to actually use these in the shop, so I'm going to save this because I'm out of them. So just all that it needs to be is any kind of hardenable file. I do prefer Nicholson, you can see right there, but whatever you have on hand will work. We're also going to need some pin stock. This is going to be for attaching the handles to the knife. It can be whatever you want it to be. It could be steel, it could be brass. You could even use some old nails if you can find the right drill bit, just something to secure the handles. We're also going to need your handle material. I'm going to use some Hawaiian koa that I have left over. But it can be, again, whatever you want. You could use wood, you could use carbon fiber, micarta. Anything that you have on hand is more than adequate. The only tools that you will need to make this knife are a drill, an angle grinder, and or a belt sander. You will need an angle grinder to cut the steel out. You could slowly grind it away, but it's going to take a lot longer. So an angle grinder is the best tool to have for this, and then if you have a belt sander, that's a lot of additional help. It will just make things look a little cleaner when you're done, but it is not necessary. You can do this entire project with an angle grinder, a drill, and then just some hand files, which conveniently we have another one of. So yeah. Now the first thing we need to do is anneal this. Right now these are very hard, and you can hear them when you rub it together. They just slide over each other. Now we want to be able to cut and grind and drill this, and that's going to be very, very, very difficult to do if it is not annealed. Most steel drill bits would not touch this at all. You would simply waste a drill. So what we're going to do is heat this up in a campfire till it is kind of a glowing red color, just hot enough to take the hardness out, so that you see this area here, that's our heat treat line. So this was quenched, this whole section. This part was not. It was likely hung from a wire and dipped down into the quenching oil. So down here, you can hear how soft it is, and I took a bite out of it. So that's what we want. So I'm going to anneal this in what is actually an attempt at a coal forge, but I'm going to just use normal wood so that you guys can see how to do this in your backyard. It's not that hard, so I'll walk you through that next. So this is how we're going to heat treat it. This is just a coal forge that I had made, but we're going to burn some wood in it, and that'll be more than fine for this. And all you got to do is just take your file and let it heat up. So we're going to let that burn down until it's nice hot coals, and then I'll come back to you guys. So here's our file after annealing. It is now nice and soft. If we take a good file and rub it on the end of it, you'll see it sounds different, and we're biting into it. I don't know if you can see that shiny part right there, but we're biting into it. This means now that we can grind it a lot easier, and now we can drill holes for the handle. So I went ahead and designed up my knife. All that I really did here is at the very edge, drop it down to a point, take a little bit off the back, just helps it to look a little cleaner. And then I just added a simple finger groove, and then we'll slightly radius this section. And then likely on the back here, just like the tip, we will also clip some of that off. For our handle material, I'm going to bring it about 2/3, 3/4 of the way up that finger groove. I don't want to go too much farther, otherwise it will mess with our plunge line. This is where we will transition from having a flat piece of metal to this part where we will bevel it down to a thinner edge. I went ahead and kind of drew that on there so I can eyeball it with the angle grinder. We're going to try to keep that nice radius so that it flows through the back of it, and it just looks a little cleaner all around, and it's a little stronger instead of having a straight line, because then you can end up with a spot here where it's a little bit thinner and you create a weak point or a stress riser. I also went ahead and marked out handle pin locations. They're not too picky. I eyeball the first two, and then usually I measure between them and just tack the second one, or the third one, sorry, in there. And that's all there is to really designing a knife. There's obviously more complex designs, and you can do whatever you want to, but for this tutorial, this is all I'm going to do. Very simple, very clean, kind of a classical, easy look. So our next step is I'm going to go ahead and cut this out with cutoff wheels in the angle grinder, and then I'm going to switch over to a generic grinding wheel, usually about 1/4 inch thick, and grind everything out and smooth it out. And then I may clean this up on the belt sander. If you have a belt sander, I do recommend doing that. It will make it easier. The lines will be a little bit cleaner. You won't have any huge bumps or ridges, but you don't have to do it. I actually, if you do not have a belt sander, use a flap disc once everything is roughed out, and the flap disc will help clean everything up and make it look really nice. I may just use the flap disc for the purposes of showing you. We'll see how it goes. So we've gotten this very close. I used an angle grinder and ground it in, but you can see it's still very rough. You know, it needs a lot of cleanup work. So we're going to use a half round file. One side is round, one side is flat. And then also that brand new flat file, just because it's a little sharper. But basically what I want to focus on is cleaning up this handle area. That's going to be very hard to grind at all after it is hardened. Usually this kind of section will get hard. The back end of this we're not going to harden because there's no reason, but it's hard to get in here and clean this area. And then we're also going to smooth out the edge of the knife as well as the back. We want to get those perfect as we can now, because it's much easier to keep clean lines with a hand file than it is to do with an angle grinder. Your other option, if you have a belt sander, you can do all of this work on a belt sander, and then you can still grind into it after it is hardened. But if you don't have a belt sander, it's very hard to grind it at all or do anything after it's hardened. So our focus right now is getting everything cleaned up, and then we can use the files. I think I'm going to show you guys how to file in a bevel as well, and then also the other one we're going to show you how to use an angle grinder and then how to use a belt sander. So as long as I don't mess this up, you'll get to see 3 different methods. If you have a hand file, belt grinder, or an angle grinder, you'll be able to do the bevels. They might look a little different, but they will be totally functional any way you do it. So let's go ahead and start cleaning this up. And for those of you that are new to filing things, you want to do as much cutting on the push as you can. And then when you're retracting it, I just kind of let it glide. You're supposed to really lift it up so you don't damage the teeth. However, I don't really care. So I push down and forward, and then when you're coming back, just kind of let it glide. Now, even though this section is not flat, it's got a radius to it. Using a flat file will help identify high and low spots and smooth them out a little bit. Technically, you'll only be cutting on the edges of the file, but it helps level everything out. Compared to a round file, it tends to dig in and make more bumps than you're getting rid of. Constantly be feeling it. Check what you're doing. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to, create huge divots and not realize it. So there we go. That's the front edge cleaned up. Now we're gonna get on the spine. I don't want it totally flat. I put a very slight radius on the whole thing and then drop off at both ends. Tends to give it kind of a sleeker look. Also, keep deburring this as you go, because these burrs will damage your vice jaws. Now, to give this back edge a final cleanup, I'm actually going to use a technique called draw filing. So you look at the direction of your teeth and set the file so that when you pull it, the teeth are cutting towards you, and it helps to smooth everything out and gives you a much better surface finish. So now we have a nice clean back, very clean. It's going to go very well later on when we go to put handles on, because once this is hardened, that'll help us prevent from over grinding or over filing the material that we use for the scales. So at this point, we're ready to drill our handle holes. Now, I kind of ballparked them before, but I'm actually going to slightly adjust them because this one is a little too close to this edge. You want them centered this direction, and then this direction I try to keep an equal spacing between the ends of the scales. And then if you want to put one in the middle, just pop it in there. You don't really need 3, 2 will do okay, but 3 tends to make it just look a little bit more tied in. And for the record, I'm completely eyeballing these. There is no method to any madness here. It is just madness. Now we're going to take a center punch. This is just a center punch. you haven't guessed, it's used for punching the center of the holes. Beautiful. I know you probably can't see that, but there's little divots now for the drill to guide itself, because otherwise on a file, having those lines, the drills try to jump all over the place. So it's a really good idea to center punch those if you can. Now, before we drill these holes, I have the right drill in the chuck here. I have a hole that is already in my table that I try to use every time, just so that way I have more support than such a huge hole, and it's closer to the edge, so it's easier for me to either clamp it or get a good grip on the knife. You do not have to use a drill press. This is my little Craftsman 1-horse, but you can easily use a hand drill. The key to drilling through steel is to go very slow with a lot of pressure. If you go really fast, you're going to go faster than what's called the cutting speed of the material. So the speed that the tip of the tool is moving relative to the workpiece. Now with this kind of drill and this kind of steel, we're looking for a very low SFM, surface feet per minute, probably around 100 to 150, which means we're going to be aiming for around 600 RPMs on this drill so that we don't burn anything up and smoke it out. WD-40 or some other light cutting fluid is also a good idea. It just helps lubricate everything and cool it down a little bit. So now we have 3 holes. These are actually 3/16 of an inch. I think they're too big. I should have gone with an 1/8 of an inch, but they'll work for what we're doing. So now we're going to grind our bevels. Now the key to grinding the bevels is to keep them centered on the front edge of the knife, and then you want to keep them an even distance from this edge back. So you want to keep that uniform. Now what we're going to do to make this easier is we're actually going to go off the back of the knife. That'll give us a distal taper on the back edge, and then right about here on both sides you're going to have what's called a plunge line. So that is where this flat section slopes down and transitions into the bevel. Now what we want to aim for, if you can still see that black line right there, is to flow it out. We don't want to make it a harsh line. We want to kind of radius it out, and that way it looks a little cleaner and it's a little bit stronger. So to do that, we already have that marked. Now we just need to scribe a center line. So I got a drill bit that is the same thickness as our knife. There we go. I had to go find that. Make sure you have a clean surface. And if you look at the very tip here, you probably can't see it, but there's a, it's called a web. There's a spot where there's kind of a line where instead of drilling, it's pushing. You want to try to turn that horizontal this way, so that way we get a nice clean line. If you have it vertical, it'll kind of leave a very wide scratch, so we want a very fine line. So I'm going to line that up. And then just scratch down the edge of the blade. Try to extend that so you can see what I'm doing. But get it lined up and just scratch it right down the edge. And then do the same. Flip it over and do it again, because if there's any variation in your knife thickness, or maybe the drill bit isn't quite there, that'll give you 2 lines. Now you're probably not going to be able to see those, but we'll give it a shot. Yeah, they're there. You can't really see them too well, but there's 2 lines. Actually, there's about, I'd say 20/1000 of an inch between them, it looks like to my eye. So we're going to grind to each of them, and that'll give us a little bit of thickness at the edge still. We don't want to grind too far, and that's actually a very common mistake. You'll grind too far one direction, and then you can't go far enough the other. So go a little bit short on each side and keep working your way back and forth. Now, for the purposes of showing you guys, I'm going to hand file for a while, maybe the whole bevel, we'll see. And then I'm also going to angle grind and belt grind on the other side, just so you can see how to do it that way. So that way, no matter which of the tools you have 3 different ways to do it, or you can use all 3. My personal preference is a belt grinder. Then I would pick an angle grinder and then try to clean that up with a hand file. And then last resort would be hand filing it, because it just takes so long to do it. But I'm going to show you guys how to do it anyways, just because we can. So here we are, ready to hand file this. Now, one of the keys to this is I have the tip and the heel very close to the edge. I have a C-clamp here. And what we're going to do is look at your file. Usually one side is coarser than the other. Some they're the same, but pick the coarsest side because that'll go the quickest. And make sure you're doing nice heavy push strokes. And then you don't want to be pushing down on the reverse because you will dull out your file. We have a lot of filing to do. So just heavy push strokes, let it glide back. And pay attention to where you are here. We want to make a nice radius plunge line. It's not too hard to do. You'll kind of get a feel for it as you go, but don't necessarily focus on that area until you get the bevel ground most of the way in. Alright, I'm bored of that. We're going to go grind this side in with the flat belt on a belt sander. I'm going to show you both with a 1-inch wide and then my professional 2x72 grinder belt. And then we're also going to do the other side with an angle grinder. I will clean up the angle grinder side with a file, just so you can see what that'll look like when it's done. And the other side will leave belt ground. This is the 1x30 belt sander. I think this was a Harbor Freight special. You can use whatever you have. If you have a flat sander for wood, if you have any kind of belt sander or even a disc sander, this will work for this. The key to this is to continually make a flat pass and then do one on a slight angle, and maybe the other way. And what that'll help do is prevent you digging in and rocking. It'll help to level everything out. So I'll do this for a while, and then once I get bored of this, I'll take you over to the big grinder that I actually use for my production knives. You're also going to want water handy, because this heats up quick. So I would fill a 1 or 3 or 5 gallon bucket with water and just dip this in it occasionally to keep the heat down. Alright, we got a water bucket. So as you can see, I'm just taking very consistent, smooth passes over it, just angling it a little bit to make sure I'm not digging into the same ruts over and over. Just by tipping it that little bit is all you need to do. Now, this thing is going to be really slow. The belt moves very slow. It's a small belt, so I'm going to jump over to the big sander and I'll show you how quick this can go. So this is my big guy. This is a 2-inch wide by 72-inch long belt. I'm running just about 5,000 surface feet per minute. This is a 36 grit ceramic belt, so this will be very quick. This is what I use when I am making my knives, but for you guys at home, I know you don't have this, but I wanted to get this video out quick to you guys, so showing you how to do it with one of these if you have one. If not, you can use any other belt sander or an angle grinder or file it in. So that's about what we're looking for. We are about halfway through, and like you can see, we have kind of a radius right here, and then a little bit of the backing. We might take that off, and we'll see how the angle grinding goes. But now I'm going to switch over to a 120 grit belt and just clean it up a little bit before I go over an angle grind on this side. We are set up to angle grind this side of the blade. I'm just going to use a standard grinding wheel on this. And go very, very, very slow. Don't put pressure down. You're basically letting the disc ride on the steel. You're not applying pressure. So take one light pass on the edge, take a look what you're doing, and just keep taking light passes. Once you get close, we're going to switch over to a flap wheel and clean it up, and then we'll go file it in the rest of the way. So there we go. I think I'm as close as I want to get. And this is what I was talking about right here. See, I totally messed up that radius. That's okay. We'll just clean it up like normal. And we'll have to go back and do the other side too, because you want them even when you heat treat it. But it's not a big deal. Angle grinders are hard to control, so that's why I said that. If you just use a belt grinder, you'll have a lot better luck with this. There's nothing wrong with this, just looks a little cleaner the other way. So let's go hand file this in the rest of the way, and then we'll move on to heat treat. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. You can see each side is a little different. So with a belt grinder, this is more like what you're gonna get. With a file or an angle grinder, this is more like what you're gonna get. It won't matter too much. I'm probably actually going to leave them different just for the sake of you guys being able to see, or I'll clean both sides up more with the angle grinder so they're the same, or the belt grinder. From here, we're gonna go on to heat treat. But before we do that, on this filed side, it's very marked up, I guess is the best way to put it. To clean that up, we can do a knife maker's least favorite thing. So fair warning for all you guys out there that make knives, I'm about to say it. We can hand sand this to make it smooth. Now, the reasons we don't want to hand sand are way too many. The reasons that we do want to hand sand are we will get a nice, flat, even finish. And it is easier to do the bulk of it now before we harden this blade. So that's something I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start with a piece of 220 and hand sand this out. Or I would, except I don't feel like doing that. So I'm gonna go ahead and match both of these bevels with the belt grinder and make everything match. That way it'll be even for heat treat. But before we heat treat, I will show you how I hand sand, just because we can. So here we have it. I cleaned it up a little bit. I made sure that these bevels match on both sides. That's so that we don't run into any issues with the heat treat. The edge is a little thin, I'm gonna admit. It's probably about 20 thousandths of an inch. The back has a nice slow taper all the way to the end. So what we're gonna do now is grab your favorite piece of wood that you don't want anymore and clamp it so that you can get to all of the edge without smashing your fingers on the wood, and clamp her down. Now we're going to take some 220 grit sandpaper. This is the black kind, whatever that is. This is actually from Harbor Freight. I really like this stuff. It's super cheap, cuts pretty well for the price, especially on softer metals. And then I also have this small block of oak that I cut into the shape of one of these when you fold it down long enough. And then on one side I put leather. I don't really use this side much, so we're just going to use the other side. Get a fresh piece for every side. There's no point in wasting 10 minutes on a bad piece of sandpaper. This stuff is cheap. As you can see, it is pretty much cleaned up all the way. Still got a couple marks right here, and then on this side, that was actually from the file when I hand filed it in. I cut a little too deep, but that's all right. We will work with this. So from here, we're gonna go into heat treat. So just like before, we're gonna go out and build up a fire. Okay guys, I'm getting ready to do the heat treat. I have just a standard campfire here. Now the key is that you need that very hot bed of coals. I think you guys can see right down in that area, it's very nice and orange. That's what we're looking for. So, you gotta be careful. You don't wanna burn the edge of the knife, and if you look at the knife, the edge is, you know, pretty thin. So we wanna lay it in there this way. I mean, pointed that direction, but lay it so the edge is up so we don't burn it. That way most of the heat will get concentrated on the back and into the blade, and we won't cook the edge off. For a quench oil, I just have a gallon of canola oil in it's an old WD-40 can, but whatever you want to use. You can use any can or container that you have. I do recommend metal, but it doesn't have to be. Canola oil will work just fine for a file. I would not use this with professional steel, depending on what I'm doing, but for our purposes, this will work more than well enough. So, we will go ahead and stick the knife in. Now, we want to make sure that we get a deep red color, maybe into orange, but the problem is it's daylight. It's very, very, very hard to see. So, what we will likely end up doing to make sure that we're hot enough is actually using a hair dryer to add air to the fire and cook it up and get it hot enough. The key is to keep a lot of coals pushed up tight against the knife. If they're 2 inches away from it, they're not going to add any heat to the knife, so you want to keep coals pushed up nice and tight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get a hair dryer, push all the coals in tight, and then start applying air. And then when it gets to temperature, we'll go ahead and quench. And here we go. We have it pretty much done. It is hard, and I'll check it with a file so you can see. Nice high-pitched noises, no damage to the edge. It's hard, but it's glass hard. So what we just did was called quenching, which made it hard. So now we want to temper it down a little bit. Tempering can be done anywhere from 300 to 900 degrees depending on your steel and what you want it to do. But for pretty much every file in existence, we're going to aim for 400 degrees for 2 hours. Now this is easy to do in your kitchen oven. Just make sure you get all the oil off, or it will smell like French fries for a few days. Or if you like that, maybe leave the oil on. But the point is, you can do this in your kitchen oven, very easy. I would recommend setting this inside of something. So take maybe a big glass pan or something to help distribute the heat more evenly. What you don't want is the elements in your oven turning on and creating a temporary hot spot that's, say, 800 degrees, and then that 800 degree air hitting your edge where it's very thin and heating it up too much. Because if we heat it too much, it'll get butter soft again, and this will not perform as a knife. So what we want to do is either temper it in the oven. You can do it in the toaster oven. I'm actually going to use a professional heat treat oven just because I have it and it won't smell the whole house up. So if you have a heat treat oven, great. If not, just do this in your kitchen oven, toaster oven, whatever you have to do it with. So let's go throw that in, and then part 2 will be coming out in hopefully 2 to 3 days. What we'll do in part 2 is hand sand these bevels again, make them clean and shiny, or you can leave them however energetic you're feeling. And then we will cut out and glue on and pin on the handles and shape them. And then maybe we'll get ambitious and make a sheath. That might be in a part 3. We'll see how it goes. I don't want to make these videos too long, but here it is. That is your first knife, whatever yours looks like. Hopefully it looks like this or a little better, actually. Hopefully a little better. This one's special. But I would give you guys some bonus features or whatever you want to call it. We have the knife. Just putting it in the oven. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell it program one segment. So that's all we're doing. We're going to ramp at full to 400 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it for 2 hours. And that's all there is to it.